You're taught that Hitler started World War II because he was pure evil and greedy, but that's far from the truth. There are actually 7 key reasons that forced him into war. Hitler had been in power for 6 years by September 1939. During those years, he'd achieved remarkable territorial gains through threats and diplomatic pressure. European powers backed down rather than fight. The pattern was clear and the strategy was working. Suddenly, in September 1939, he abandoned this successful approach. He invaded Poland, triggering declarations of war from Britain and France. He gambled everything on military conflict when diplomatic pressure had been delivering results consistently. What follows is the story of how those 7 reasons built, converged, and finally exploded into the most destructive war in human history. Section 1. Economic fraud collapsing. Germany's entire rearmament was built on fraud, and by 1939, the bills were literally coming due. Between 1933 and 1939, the nation spent over 60 billion marks on weapons and military buildup. This number was staggering for a country that just 4 years earlier had been destroyed by the Great Depression. In 1933, when the regime first took power, 6 million Germans had no jobs. That was roughly 30% of everyone who could work. Industrial production had collapsed to just 58% of its 1928 peak levels. Across the country, banks failed, businesses closed permanently, and hunger and desperation became visible in every major city. However, within just 6 years, the country had built one of the most powerful militaries in the world from almost nothing. The transformation was remarkable. An army that had been limited to 100,000 men under the Versailles Treaty now numbered 3.7 million troops. That was a 37-fold increase in just 6 years. No nation in modern history had ever expanded its military so rapidly in peacetime. An air force that didn't officially exist in 1933 now had thousands of modern aircraft. Tank divisions rolled off assembly lines while warships were under construction in shipyards. The question that puzzled many observers, both inside and outside the country, was simple. How was this even economically possible? The answer lay in brilliant financial trickery created by Hjalmar Schacht. He was the genius banker who served as both president of the Reichsbank and Reich Minister of Economics during those crucial early years. Historical accounts from William Schirer's detailed research reveal that Schacht was perhaps the only man in the government who truly understood both international finance and the German economy. Morally flexible but intellectually brilliant, he knew something about money that most economists didn't. At its core, money is organized belief and collective trust. If people accept something as valuable, then it has value, at least temporarily, until that perception collapses. The critical trick was maintaining that confidence long enough to accomplish your goals before the inevitable reckoning arrived. His particular genius was creating an elaborate system that allowed massive military spending while successfully hiding its true costs and scale from virtually everyone until it was far too late to turn back. Schacht's masterpiece was the Mefo bill system, named after a shell company created purely to hide weapons spending. Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or the Metal Research Company, was officially founded in 1934 with a nominal capital of just 1 million marks. The company existed only on paper with no actual operations whatsoever. Through this system, approximately 12 billion marks in Mefo bills were issued between 1934 and 1938, which combined with other deficit spending, financed roughly 60 billion marks in total military spending, much of it hidden from official scrutiny. This was an absurdly small sum for what the company would soon be doing. 4 major industrial firms were publicly listed as shareholders to provide legitimacy: Siemens, Gute Hoffnungshütte, Krupp, and Rheinmetall. These prestigious companies were merely convenient fronts. The real owner and controller was the government itself, operating through representatives. The shell company had no employees, no office, and conducted no actual business despite its name. It existed solely as a mechanism for financing rearmament, while hiding that spending from the Reichstag, the public, and international observers who were watching the nation nervously. Here's how a typical transaction worked. When the Wehrmacht needed 100 new tanks, it would place an order with Krupp, one of the premier arms manufacturers. Krupp would accept the order and begin manufacturing the tanks using its factories, workers, and materials. But instead of sending a conventional bill to the government treasury for immediate payment using taxpayer money, which would appear in official budgets where it could be scrutinized, Krupp does something different. The company draws a bill of exchange on the Mefo company for the full payment amount. This bill was an elaborate IOU, a promissory note guaranteeing payment from the Mefo company within 5 years. Krupp then takes this bill to the Reichsbank, the nation's central bank. The Reichsbank discounts the bill, meaning it gives Krupp cash immediately, less a small discount for the early payment, in exchange for holding the Mefo bill until its maturity date 5 years later. Krupp receives immediate payment, the Reichsbank holds the bill as an asset, and the Wehrmacht gets its tanks, all within days, with no parliamentary approval needed. Additionally, it financed massive rearmament without immediately triggering obvious inflation throughout the economy. In a normal peacetime economy, printing 60 billion marks and pumping it into circulation would cause prices to jump immediately. Too much money chasing too few goods would trigger raging inflation and currency collapse. But Mefo bills weren't officially currency or money in the conventional sense. They were technically private commercial paper, promissory notes from one company to another that merely happened to be discounted and guaranteed by the central bank. The inflation was real but delayed and hidden across the economy, rather than immediate and obvious. For several crucial years, the nation appeared to be performing an economic miracle. Full employment returned, industry grew fast, and the military expanded dramatically. To domestic and international observers, it appeared to be an economic miracle without the usual consequences like inflation and currency collapse. Still, the system had a critical weakness. Schacht knew this system couldn't last forever. Mefo bills had fixed 5-year maturity periods written directly into their terms. They earned 4% annual interest, making them attractive to hold as investments. Most critically and dangerously, they were explicitly guaranteed by the government, which gave them perceived safety and legitimacy. But when the bills matured, the government would have to pay with real money, not more IOUs or accounting tricks. They needed actual currency backed by gold or foreign exchange. The system was a temporary fix, buying time for rapid rearmament while Hitler seized total power. But the bills would eventually come due, and the fraud would be exposed. The first Mefo bills were issued in 1934. They had a 5-year maturity, meaning they would come due in 1939. As early as 1937, Schacht began warning Hitler repeatedly and urgently that the system was approaching its limits. The total amount of outstanding bills was becoming enormous and growing monthly. By 1938, the problem was clear. Approximately 12 billion marks worth of Mefo bills would come due in 1939. Neither the Reichsbank nor the government had anything close to that amount in actual money. Schacht's warnings became increasingly urgent through 1937 and 1938. He sounded desperate alarms that the whole structure would collapse if the nation didn't either slow military spending dramatically or find new sources of revenue from conquest. When the bills started maturing in 1939, the government would face a brutal choice: admit the entire scheme was fraudulent and face catastrophic collapse, or somehow find massive new revenue from outside the existing system. His advice was clear, the economic facts were undeniable, and the math was simple. Without dramatic changes, disaster was inevitable. The Nazi government's response was characteristically brutal. In January 1939, Schacht was dismissed as Reichsbank president. The dismissal didn't solve the underlying problem. It just silenced the one person loudly warning about the approaching crisis. His replacement, Walter Funk, was more compliant, but far less competent, and the military spending continued without restraint. Even beyond the Mefo bills fraud, other economic pressures were mounting. The country lacked basic resources needed for modern warfare, producing almost no petroleum from domestic sources. Historical records show the nation produced only about 10% of its oil domestically, including early synthetic fuel production. Oil was the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ships all required fuel, and everything about modern military operations depended on adequate petroleum supplies. The nation had to import nearly all its oil from foreign sources. Romanian oil fields provided some supply, but nowhere near enough for sustained operations. The Soviet Union had vast oil reserves, but relations with Moscow were unpredictable. Middle Eastern oil was controlled by Britain and France. American oil was an ocean away and would be cut off in any war with the Western powers. The oil situation alone created enormous strategic vulnerability. Beyond oil, the list of critical resource shortages was extensive and growing. Iron ore was needed in massive quantities for weapons production. While the nation had some domestic iron ore, it was insufficient for the scale of rearmament underway. High-grade Swedish iron ore had to be imported through routes that could be easily cut off in wartime. Copper was essential for electrical wiring in everything from aircraft to radios to artillery fire control systems, and for shell casings for artillery and small arms ammunition. Major companies like Krupp, IG Farben, and Siemens needed copper desperately. But domestic production was minimal, and imports provided nearly all supply. The shortage wasn't limited to oil and copper. Dozens of other critical materials existed only in limited domestic quantities. Tin went into specialized metal alloys. Tungsten was essential for armor-piercing ammunition. Chromium hardened steel armor. Nickel was required for stainless steel, and molybdenum strengthened steel for high-stress applications. Rubber was essential for tires on everything from trucks to aircraft. But natural rubber had to be imported while synthetic production remained inadequate. The list of critical imported materials was long and growing. Each shortage created vulnerability, and each import dependency created a potential choke point that enemies could exploit. Historical records show that German military planners were acutely aware of these vulnerabilities and knew that any prolonged conflict would expose these resource shortages catastrophically. In 1936, Hermann Göring launched an ambitious 4-year plan with the goal of achieving economic self-sufficiency by 1940. The plan aimed to develop synthetic substitutes for imported materials, increase domestic production of critical resources, and prepare the economy for war. It failed. 3 years later, the nation remained dangerously dependent on imports, with dependency in some areas actually increasing rather than decreasing. The country now had a massive military establishment consuming resources at exponentially accelerating rates, with no way to supply those needs domestically. The expanded military was systematically depleting resources that domestic production couldn't provide. Each of those 3.7 million soldiers required food, uniforms, boots, weapons, ammunition, training, and transportation, and the gap between production and consumption was widening every month. Still, one statistic from 1938 captured the entire problem. 52% of all government spending went directly to the military. This was a full wartime economy during peacetime. Historical analysis shows that developed nations usually spent 10 to 15% of their budgets on military forces during peacetime, with 20% considered high and 30% indicating war preparation. The nation was spending like it was already at war without acquiring any new resources or territory. The bills were mounting, the resources were depleting, and the system was consuming itself. Living standards had genuinely risen between 1933 and 1936. Unemployment had fallen from 6 million people to nearly zero. Industrial production had recovered dramatically, and wages had risen. For many Germans, life had gotten noticeably better during those years, and the regime could rightfully claim credit for pulling the nation out of the Depression's depths. However, by 1939, that trend had reversed. Rationing was quietly introduced for consumer goods and food, while shortages became common in daily life. Farm workers drafted into military service meant tighter food supplies, and wages were flat or falling even as prices rose. The famous slogan, "Guns instead of butter," was a literal economic policy, with resources that would normally produce consumer goods being forcibly diverted to military production. The Nazi government's propaganda machine, controlled by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, worked constantly to explain these mounting sacrifices as necessary and temporary. The message was consistent and repeated endlessly through newspapers, radio, films, and public speeches. The nation was surrounded by jealous enemies who wanted to keep it weak, and current hardships were the unavoidable price of security. Once the country was sufficiently strong, life would improve dramatically for everyone. The propaganda was sophisticated and effective for several years, successfully maintaining public support or at least public compliance. But even the most sophisticated apparatus could only mask harsh economic reality for a limited time. Without major external victories to justify the hardships, domestic discontent would inevitably grow. What made this economic crisis even more desperate was the nation's growing isolation from global trade systems. Britain and France controlled the world's major trade routes through their powerful navies. The Royal Navy, the largest naval force on Earth, dominated the Atlantic, controlled Mediterranean access through Gibraltar, and protected Asian trade routes through the Suez Canal. Any future war with Britain would mean a naval blockade, just as had happened during World War I, when the blockade nearly starved the country into submission and hundreds of thousands of civilians died from malnutrition. The memory of those years remained fresh, and another blockade would be even more devastating given increased resource dependencies. The nation couldn't access overseas markets reliably in peacetime, and certainly not in wartime against Britain and France. Global commodity markets were denominated in British pounds or American dollars. International shipping was dominated by British merchant vessels, and insurance for international trade was provided by British firms. The entire architecture of global trade ran through British-controlled systems. The Third Reich tried to solve this through bilateral barter agreements with smaller countries, particularly in Southeastern Europe and Latin America. The nation would exchange manufactured goods for raw materials directly without using currency. German tractors for Romanian oil, chemicals for Yugoslav copper, machinery for Brazilian coffee, and industrial equipment for Hungarian agricultural products. These barter arrangements offered several advantages. They didn't require scarce foreign currency reserves, didn't depend on international financial markets, allowed the country to obtain resources from nations that might not otherwise sell to it, and created economic dependencies that could be leveraged for political influence. Bilateral barter trade increased significantly between 1933 and 1939. The nation developed especially close economic relationships with Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Hungary, and several Latin American countries, exchanging tractors, machinery, chemicals, and manufactured goods for oil, agricultural products, minerals, and timber. These arrangements helped ease some pressure but couldn't solve the fundamental resource problems. The trading partners themselves had limited production capacity. Romania's oil fields, Yugoslavia's minerals, Bulgaria's agriculture, and Hungary's food supplies were all insufficient to meet the enormous needs of a fully mobilized military. The bilateral trade network provided helpful relief but couldn't substitute for full access to global markets. Moreover, these trading relationships were vulnerable. The Balkan countries were small and weak, subject to pressure from other powers. Britain and France were actively working to limit German economic penetration of southeastern Europe, while the Soviet Union watched German expansion there with suspicion. These trade relationships couldn't be relied upon in a major crisis. By August 1939, the economic crisis had reached its breaking point. The Mefo bills issued in 1934 were now coming due, with billions of marks needing payment over the coming months. The money wasn't there, and the fraud was approaching inevitable exposure. Meanwhile, the trading arrangements that had provided some relief remained vulnerable to outside pressure, and access to global markets remained blocked by British naval power. Clearly, the math was simple and brutal. The system couldn't survive without dramatic action. People could see their living standards declining. Foreign currency reserves were depleting, trade imbalances were growing, and debt was mounting. The financial structure was showing cracks across multiple systems simultaneously. The nation faced a brutal choice: drastically cut military spending and face economic and political collapse, or seize massive new resources through military conquest. There was no middle path. Cutting military spending was impossible by this point. It would mean publicly admitting that 6 years of sacrifice had been wasted, demobilizing millions of soldiers, closing weapons factories employing hundreds of thousands, and abandoning the goal of restoring national greatness. Such a reversal would destroy the Nazi leadership's credibility with core supporters who had endured hardships based on promises of future prosperity. Most importantly, it would mean abandoning Lebensraum, the living space in the East that was central to the entire ideological project. That left conquest as the only path forward. Successful military campaigns could provide the desperately needed resources. Seized gold and currency from conquered central banks could pay the maturing Mefo bills. Occupied territories could supply oil and raw materials, and factories in conquered nations could produce goods for the war effort. Each successful conquest would theoretically provide resources for the next, making the system self-sustaining through continuous expansion. This was the economic logic driving the nation toward war. The existing system was unsustainable. Contraction meant collapse. Expansion through conquest was the only path that offered hope of survival. As September 1939 arrived, the economic crisis left only one option: attack Poland, seize eastern territories, and hope to win quickly before the entire structure collapsed under its own weight. The Mefo bills had created a ticking time bomb. The bills were coming due. The banking system couldn't absorb them, and inflation threatened to expose the whole fraud. War wasn't just a choice driven by belief or ambition. It had become an economic necessity forced by a system that couldn't sustain itself in peacetime. But the fraud itself was only the surface. Something far more disturbing lay underneath. Section 2. The nationalized war economy. How did this fraudulent system even begin? The answer comes from detailed historical research, particularly economist Adam Tooze's comprehensive study, The Wages of Destruction, which examined thousands of government documents, business records, and eyewitness accounts from the period. What these sources reveal is a system of total state control that was established from the very first weeks of Nazi rule. The process began just 3 weeks after Hitler became chancellor. Historical records document that on Monday evening, February 20th, 1933, approximately 25 of Germany's most powerful businessmen received urgent summons to Hermann Göring's villa in Berlin. Göring, acting as president of the Reichstag, invited them to hear Hitler explain his policies. The businessmen arrived at 6 o'clock in the evening, expecting a policy discussion. They would leave understanding that everything had changed. The group included some of the most important names in German industry. Georg von Schnitzler attended from E.G. Farben, Germany's largest chemical corporation. Krupp von Bohlen came representing the Krupp armaments empire. Dr. Albert Vögler attended as head of Vereinigte Stahlwerke, the world's second-largest steel company. About 20 other businessmen filled out the room, representing banking, mining, and manufacturing interests. According to accounts from the meeting, Hitler kept them waiting for a considerable time before appearing. When he finally entered, he didn't come to negotiate or discuss. He came to inform them of decisions already made. His speech lasted about an hour and focused on a single theme: the turning point in German history marked by defeat and revolution in 1918. Documents from the meeting reveal Hitler's position. He stated that private enterprise could not be maintained in the age of democracy. Business was founded on principles of personality and individual leadership. Democracy and liberalism inevitably led to social democracy and communism. The time had come to crush the opposition completely. In other words, democracy and private business could not coexist. One had to go. Hitler explained that the process would begin after the March 5th elections. If the Nazis gained control of the Reichstag through constitutional means, well and good. But he was explicit about the alternative. Records show he stated that regardless of the outcome, there would be no retreat. If the election didn't provide the necessary authority, the decision would be brought about by other means. He wasn't asking for permission. He was announcing his intentions. When Hitler finished speaking, Hermann Göring addressed the practical matter. Historical accounts record that Göring explained German business had a major stake in the struggle against the left. Therefore, business should make an appropriate financial contribution to the Nazi election campaign. Göring added a remarkable promise. The sacrifices would be easier to bear if businessmen realized that the March 5th election would surely be the last one for the next 10 years. Probably, he suggested, for the next 100 years. Unfortunately, this wasn't a friendly request for voluntary donations. The businessmen understood the implicit threat. Evidence shows that Krupp von Bohlen had prepared extensive notes for a detailed economic policy discussion. He had expected to negotiate terms and discuss specific business concerns. Confronted with this bald demand for money, he thought better of introducing tedious details. Instead, he confined himself to brief remarks about needing a speedy resolution of the political situation. Business supported establishing a strong and independent state under which the economy could develop and flourish. Hjalmar Schacht, the Reichsbank president attending the meeting, then collected the money. Financial records show he proposed an election fund of 3 million Reichsmarks to be shared between the Nazis and their nationalist coalition partners. Over the following 3 weeks, Schacht received contributions from 17 different business groups. IG Farben contributed 400,000 Reichsmarks, the largest single donation. Deutsche Bank provided 200,000. Mining industry associations contributed 400,000. The Berlin Automobile Exhibition organizers sent 100,000. Electrical engineering companies, including Telefunken and AEG, contributed substantial amounts. The money came in steadily. This cash injection arrived at a crucial moment when the Nazi Party was severely short of funds. As Göring had predicted, it would be the last competitive election in German history. The businessmen had effectively financed the end of German democracy. Whether they fully understood this at the time remains debatable, but the evidence cannot be dodged. They were willing partners in what came next. Yet the meeting itself was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. Within months, the regime moved beyond collecting money to seizing direct control of businesses. The most blatant example came on October 17, 1933, just 8 months after Hitler took power. Historical records document that early that morning, Dr. Hugo Junkers was arrested at his vacation home in Bayerischzell. Hugo Junkers was Germany's leading aviation pioneer. His plant at Dessau had constructed the world's first full-metal aircraft. By 1933, Junkers operated by far the largest aircraft factory in Germany. He was a celebrated engineer and a conservative nationalist who eagerly embraced the cause of rearmament. None of this protected him. The official charge was treason. The real reason was simpler and more direct. He owned the largest aircraft plant in Germany, and Hermann Göring and his Secretary of State Erhard Milch were determined to have control of it. Historical accounts reveal that in the 1920s, Junkers had argued with German military officials about the future direction of aerial rearmament. The new holders of power were not willing to argue. They simply took what they wanted. Documents show that after 24 hours in police detention, Junkers agreed to sign away his firm to the Reich. He had no choice. Managerial control was immediately placed in the hands of Heinrich Koppenberg, a veteran of the Flick industrial conglomerate who had made his reputation in armaments production during World War I. A new supervisory board was installed, including government representatives and state-controlled bank officials. Junkers himself was removed completely from the company he had built. Historians note that this was one of the most blatant acts of coercion applied to any non-Jewish business in the entire history of the Third Reich. It established an unmistakable precedent. If the Nazi leadership wanted your factory, they would take it. Your reputation, your contributions to German industry, and your political loyalty meant nothing. What mattered was whether the state wanted what you owned. However, outright seizures like Junkers were rare for political reasons. The regime preferred a different approach that maintained the appearance of private enterprise while establishing complete state control. Over the next 2 years, government records show the creation of an elaborate system of compulsory business organizations that gave officials direct supervision over every aspect of economic life. Hjalmar Schacht designed the framework in autumn 1934 and spring 1935. The system divided the entire German economy into hierarchical groups. At the top were Reich groups for industry, banking, insurance, and other major sectors. Below these were business groups for specific industries like mining, steel, and engineering. Below those were branch groups for specialized subdivisions within each industry. Every German firm was required to enroll in the appropriate groups. This wasn't voluntary. Membership was compulsory. Each group and subgroup was headed by its own Führer. These leaders were nominated by existing business associations, vetted by the Reich Group, and appointed by Schacht. In theory, businessmen were selecting their own leaders. In practice, the government was choosing who would control each industry. The business groups served as the communication channel between individual firms and the Reich Ministry of Economic Affairs. Government decrees flowed downward from the ministry through the business groups to individual companies. Reports, complaints, and requests for permission flowed upward from companies through the business groups to Berlin. Official records show the groups produced endless publications, guidelines, and recommendations for best practice in their industries. In other words, nothing happened in German business without government knowledge and approval. The business groups were empowered to collect compulsory reports from their members. This created an unprecedented system of industrial statistics. The government now knew exactly what every company was producing, what materials they were using, and what profits they were earning. After 1936, the groups were authorized to penetrate even further into companies' internal operations by imposing standardized bookkeeping systems. But even as this bureaucratic structure was being built, a severe financial crisis was developing. Throughout 1933, the Reichsbank had maintained foreign currency reserves of about 400 million Reichsmarks. That amount could cover several weeks of imports if needed. However, the regime's decision to spend enormous amounts on military rearmament while refusing to pay foreign debts created mounting pressure on these reserves. Germany needed to import raw materials like oil, copper, and cotton. These imports had to be paid for in foreign currency that Germany didn't have. Meanwhile, German exports were falling. Other countries were buying fewer German products. The gap between import costs and export earnings was widening every month. By February 1934, the reserves began falling rapidly. The situation was becoming critical. Financial experts normally recommend that a country's central bank should hold enough reserves to cover at least 6 months of imports. Germany's reserves were dropping toward dangerously low levels. Then, in March 1934, came a crucial confrontation that would seal Germany's fate. Historical records document that Hitler held a meeting at his mountain retreat in Obersalzberg. Both the Minister of Economic Affairs and the Finance Minister attended. According to accounts, they had agreed beforehand not to approve more than 15 billion Reichsmarks for rearmament. That amount was already enormous, but they thought it was the maximum Germany could afford. At the meeting, the Minister of Economic Affairs began explaining the financial constraints and the harsh reality of Germany's foreign exchange crisis. The falling reserves were creating an emergency. Germany would soon lack the foreign currency to maintain even minimal imports. Then Hjalmar Schacht interrupted. Documents show that Schacht announced no amount of money was too much for rearmament. He declared his willingness to ruin the currency in pursuit of military buildup. Hitler sided with Schacht immediately. The military budget would not be cut. Instead, everything else would be sacrificed to protect military spending. The decision was final. This choice had immediate consequences. Over the following months, the financial crisis accelerated. By June 1934, the Reichsbank's foreign currency reserves had dropped below 100 million Reichsmarks. For a major industrial economy like Germany, this was catastrophically low. That amount could barely cover 1 week of imports at minimal levels. Germany had reserves for approximately 1 week when it needed reserves for 6 months. The country was effectively bankrupt. It couldn't pay for the raw materials needed to keep factories running. Yet this crisis was not an accident or simple economic mismanagement. The crisis resulted directly from the deliberate choices made in March and earlier. The regime had committed to massive rearmament regardless of economic reality. Now the consequences were arriving. On June 14, 1934, the German government declared it would stop paying its international debts. Germany simply didn't have the foreign currency to pay what it owed to other countries. The announcement shocked the world financial system. Official documents reveal that on June 23, 1934, the Reichsbank abandoned its system of orderly monthly foreign exchange rationing. Instead, it switched to daily allocation, doling out tiny amounts of foreign currency each day based on whatever export earnings came in. 2 days later, the British Parliament held an emergency 48-hour session and rushed through legislation allowing the government to confiscate earnings from German exporters. Even normally cautious British politicians spoke in harsh terms. Britain was threatening economic war. Eyewitness accounts record that on June 28, 1934, the Minister of Economic Affairs Kurt Schmidt was giving a speech when he suddenly collapsed. He had been explaining the economic situation when he asked aloud what was to be done. Then the blood drained from his face and he fainted, falling forward across his podium. Water from his glass dribbled across the pages of his speech. The question hung in the air unanswered. Nobody knew what to do. Even so, the regime had already committed to a solution: total economic control. In August 1934, just weeks after the June crisis, government records show that Schacht implemented what became known as the New Plan. The plan created an elaborate bureaucracy to control every aspect of Germany's foreign trade. 25 surveillance agencies were established, one for each major category of imported goods. These agencies would employ thousands of officials and clerks. private businesses would employ thousands more to handle the paperwork. Every import had to be approved by the appropriate surveillance agency. Companies wanting to buy foreign goods had to submit applications explaining why they needed the imports. The agencies then decided which applications to approve based on government priorities. Official documents make clear the top priorities were always the same: armaments production and export industries. If your company was building weapons for the military, you received the foreign currency you needed. If your company could sell products abroad and earn foreign exchange, you also received approval. But if your company made consumer goods for the domestic market, you received little or nothing. The system explicitly favored war production over civilian needs. Companies that received approval were issued exchange certificates. Official regulations established that these certificates were required for all imports starting in 1935. Without a certificate, importing goods became illegal. The system gave the government complete control over what could be brought into Germany. In other words, the state decided what every business could buy, how much it could buy, and when it could buy it. The surveillance agencies didn't actually import goods themselves. They just controlled access to foreign currency. Private companies still conducted the actual trade, but since companies couldn't trade without government approval, this distinction meant little in practice. The system maintained the appearance of private enterprise while operating as a command economy. Beyond import controls, government records document that the state also took control of prices throughout the economy. When the foreign exchange crisis hit in the summer of 1934, panic buying broke out. Merchants and consumers feared shortages and rushed to buy goods before prices rose further. The government responded by imposing systematic price controls. In the textile industry, official decrees limited factories to 36-hour work weeks. New investment in textile plants required explicit government permission. These restrictions remained in place for years. The goal was preventing price increases that might reveal the severity of the crisis. Historical records show the government also controlled wages, working conditions, and labor mobility. Workers couldn't change jobs freely, the businesses couldn't set their own prices, and the banks couldn't make loans without approval. Every major economic decision required government authorization. Beyond this, the system came with enormous costs. The economy essentially split in two. Industries producing investment goods and armaments experienced rapid growth. Factories making weapons, aircraft, ships, and military vehicles operated at full capacity. These sectors received all the imported raw materials they needed. Workers in these industries had steady employment and rising wages. Meanwhile, industries producing consumer goods suddenly stopped growing. Statistical records reveal the textile and clothing industries were hit particularly hard. These sectors employed roughly 20% of Germany's industrial workforce. Census data shows about 3 million people worked in textile manufacturing, leather goods, shoes, and clothing production. These industries depended on imported raw materials. Cotton, wool, and leather all had to be imported. Trade statistics document that in 1934, textile raw materials accounted for 26% of Germany's total import bill. The industries relied on imports for about 80% of their materials. When the government restricted foreign exchange allocations, these industries couldn't obtain raw materials. Production stalled. Economic data shows that for more than 2 years, from the spring of 1934 until 1936, consumer goods output remained essentially flat. There was virtually no growth in the production of items that ordinary Germans actually wanted to buy. This created visible hardship for millions of people. Workers in consumer industries faced reduced hours and lower wages. Some faced layoffs. Entire regions depended on export trade, and light manufacturing suffered economic stagnation, even as official propaganda celebrated economic recovery. Yet the Nazi government's propaganda tried to mask these problems. The propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, launched intensive campaigns to explain the hardships. He organized meetings and demonstrations across Germany throughout the summer of 1934. The message was always the same. Germans had a duty to accept shortages and restrictions. The foreign exchange crisis required sacrifice from everyone. Overcoming these difficulties was a patriotic obligation. But historical accounts show the campaigns often backfired. In many areas, the meetings were so poorly attended that organizers quietly canceled them. In other places, Goebbels' dramatic rhetoric actually made things worse. His speeches alerted people to the full extent of the crisis. Instead of calming fears, the propaganda heightened anxiety. Secret police reports from the summer and autumn of 1934 reveal widespread discontent. The Gestapo noted that Germans were far more upset about economic problems than about political violence. The mood was described as apathetic and gloomy. People openly complained in markets, at bus stops, and at labor exchanges. Construction workers on the new Autobahn sites were particularly restless. Conditions at these work camps were notoriously grim. Police records document that in October 1934, Berlin authorities reported arresting 140 workers following a mutiny at a construction site. Workers in Dortmund replaced the standard Heil Hitler greeting with ironic slogans about rising prices. These small acts of defiance revealed deep frustration with economic conditions. Nevertheless, the system survived because the regime made a clear choice. Civilian consumption would be sacrificed to protect military spending. Consumer sectors would stagnate while armaments industries boomed. Ordinary Germans would endure shortages while weapons production accelerated. Historical evidence shows the trade-off was explicit and deliberate. Foreign observers understood what was happening. The international financial press regularly pointed out the contradiction. Germany claimed it couldn't pay its debts due to foreign exchange shortages, yet military spending continued growing rapidly. The conclusion was obvious to anyone watching. Germany was choosing rearmament over debt payments. The country was choosing military power over economic stability. Diplomatic records show that in June 1934, the American ambassador to Germany made this point directly to the German foreign minister. Germany couldn't simultaneously continue massive rearmament and claim poverty when asked to service its debts. The two positions were contradictory. Historical accounts document that the British Parliament held an emergency 48-hour session in late June 1934. Even normally cautious politicians spoke in harsh terms. Britain passed legislation giving the government power to confiscate earnings from German exporters if Germany didn't pay its debts. The threat was real. Britain was Germany's main export market and chief source of hard currency. Trade statistics reveal that relations with the United States collapsed over the following years. In 1928, American exports to Germany had totaled 2 billion Reichsmarks. By 1936, they had fallen to just 232 million. German exports to America dropped from nearly 800 million Reichsmarks to less than 150 million. The trade relationship had essentially disappeared. This isolation was the direct result of Germany's autarky policy. The regime was deliberately cutting ties with the international economy. But this wasn't a choice driven by abstract ideology alone. It was a practical necessity created by the decision to prioritize rearmament above everything else. The system created in 1934 would prove remarkably durable. The 25 surveillance agencies, the import controls, the price regulations, and the export subsidies all remained in operation for the next 11 years. They formed the backbone of Germany's war economy from the very beginning. The organizational structure created to manage the 1934 crisis became permanent. Statistical records indicate that by the late 1930s, the official organizations of this system employed at least 18,000 officials, administrators, and clerks working on economic control issues. Private businesses employed thousands more to handle the required paperwork. The bureaucracy was enormous and touched every transaction in the German economy. Historians note that this structure would last until 1945, until the final collapse of the Third Reich itself. This raises an important question. Why did Hitler organize the economy this way in the first place? What made him believe that such a risky and unstable system was necessary? The answer lies in his economic beliefs that were shaped decades before he ever came to power. Section 3. The Shrinking Market's Delusion. To understand Hitler's thinking about money and trade, historians have studied his writings from the 1920s. In 1928, he wrote a book that was never published while he was alive. This book, later called his second book, shows ideas that were completely wrong about how the world economy worked. When historians like Adam Tooze looked at Nazi documents and economic records, they found that Hitler's policies came from false beliefs. He thought he understood how trade between countries worked, but he was deeply mistaken. Hitler believed the world economy was heading toward collapse. He was convinced that international trade would fail and that only nations with huge territories and resources could survive. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was the core reasoning that made him think Germany had no choice except conquest. Understanding this false belief is essential to know why he built the economic system he did and why he believed war was unavoidable. Hitler's economic vision was opposed to mainstream German thinking in the 1920s. During the 1920s, Germany's most respected political leader was Gustav Stresemann. He served as foreign minister from 1923 until his death in 1929. Stresemann represented everything Hitler hated about modern economics and international cooperation. Historical records show that Stresemann believed politics in the 20th century was first and foremost the politics of the world economy. He was convinced that economic connections between nations would prevent future wars. Stresemann's strategy was built on partnership with the United States and Britain. He recognized that Germany needed raw materials and food from overseas. Germany also needed export markets to provide its population with work and income. Britain needed Germany as an export market despite having better access to raw materials through its empire. According to Stresemann's analysis, the rise of the United States as the leading force in the world economy had changed the competition between European powers forever. The key insight driving Stresemann's policy was straightforward. In the 20th century, the future balance of power in Europe would be defined largely by how European countries related to the United States. Germany couldn't match French military power or British naval strength, but the world economy was the one area where Germany was truly essential. German industry and German exports were necessary for international trade to function properly. Documents from the period show that Stresemann's strategy worked remarkably well in the mid-1920s. The Dawes Plan of 1924 reduced Germany's immediate reparation payments by a large amount. American banks, led by J.P. Morgan, provided massive loans to Germany. Between 1925 and 1928, the flow of foreign money was so large that Germany could make reparations payments without even needing to earn a trade surplus. American money was essentially paying Germany's debts. The strategy seemed to be working exactly as planned. By 1928, American financial interests were pushing for further reductions in Germany's reparation obligations. Stresemann saw the rise of the United States as a stabilizing factor in European affairs. He believed that predictable economic development would enable Germany's recovery without military conflict. The future looked peaceful and prosperous. Yet Hitler saw the world completely differently. Historical analysis reveals that Hitler lived in what scholars describe as a strange and hostile mental universe. He believed that liberal ideas about progress through industry and trade were nothing more than lies spread by Jewish propagandists. Where Stresemann saw cooperation and mutual benefit, Hitler saw winner-take-all competition and certain conflict. Hitler's early writings already showed this dark worldview. In Mein Kampf, written in 1924 while Hitler was imprisoned after his failed coup attempt, he laid out his basic beliefs about race and struggle. However, in that book, the United States barely appeared in his strategic thinking. His focus was almost entirely on Europe. But over the next 4 years, Hitler's thinking evolved. Historical evidence shows that as a child, Hitler had been an enthusiastic reader of German Western novels about America. By the mid-1920s, this interest had taken on a darker character. He viewed President Wilson, who had negotiated the Versailles Treaty, as a criminal supported by Jewish bankers. As American economic influence in Europe grew, Hitler could no longer ignore the United States. By 1928, Hitler's obsession with America had become central to his worldview. That summer, he wrote a second book that was never published while he was alive. This manuscript, later called his second book, reveals how much his thinking had changed since 1924. America had moved from the background to center stage in his strategic calculations. Hitler's second book contains a remarkable passage about American influence on European society. According to the text, he observed that the European of 1928 dreamed of a standard of living taken from America's real conditions as much as from Europe's possibilities. Because of modern technology and communication, international relations among peoples had become so close that Europeans, even without knowing it fully, were using American life as the measure for their own existence. This observation was actually accurate. Germany in the late 1920s and 1930s was what economists would call a country caught in the middle. Historical records and economic data reveal that Germans were deeply involved in the world of Hollywood movies and American consumer culture. But at the same time, millions of Germans lived 3 or 4 people to a room without indoor bathrooms or electricity. Motor vehicles, radios, and household appliances were dreams of the wealthy, not common possessions. Germany's living standard was roughly similar to countries like Iran or South Africa today. Yet Hitler drew a very specific conclusion from this observation about American influence. According to Hitler's analysis preserved in his writings, America's enormous competitive advantage in industrial technology came mainly from the size of America's internal market and its wealth in buying power and raw materials. It was the huge volume of guaranteed internal sales that allowed the American motor vehicle industry to use methods of production that would be impossible in Europe because of lack of such internal sales. Scholars summarizing Hitler's logic have noted that he basically believed mass production required living space. Mass production techniques pioneered by American companies like Ford depended on having a vast, unified market with abundant resources. In Hitler's mind, if Germany wanted to compete with American industrial power, it would need to create a similar economic space. That meant conquering territory to match America's continental scale. This wasn't about getting colonies overseas. Hitler clearly rejected the idea of colonial empire as scattering Germany's precious blood around the world. Instead, he favored conquest of connected living space in the East. But the purpose wasn't to gain the people living in those territories. Historical documents make clear that Hitler intended the population of conquered territories to be removed. The earlier Imperial German government had lacked the nerve for extreme racial policy, but Hitler believed there was no alternative to ruthless conquest and forced removal of populations if Germany was to succeed. But Hitler's reasoning went beyond just competing with America's economy. Hitler believed he understood a basic flaw in the global trading system that others were blind to. According to his theory, international trade was entering a death spiral that would certainly collapse. This was the shrinking market's delusion at the core of Nazi economic thinking. Records from Hitler's second book reveal his core belief about international economics. He wrote that the final decision in the struggle for the world market would come down to force, not peaceful competition. Any effort by Germans to save themselves through industry and trade would eventually bring them into competition with Britain. This would recreate the alliance that had defeated Germany in 1914. The international Jewish conspiracy that Hitler believed controlled finance in London, Washington, and Moscow would again force Germany into defeat. Hitler's argument, as preserved in his writings, went like this. The current world market for goods was not unlimited. The number of industrial nations had steadily increased. Almost all European peoples suffered from having too many people and not enough territory, and therefore depended on international exports. America and Japan had recently joined the competition. The struggle for limited markets was naturally becoming fiercer. The critical part of his theory was what would happen next. According to Hitler's analysis, while the number of peoples competing in the world market increased, the market itself would gradually become smaller. This would happen partly because other nations would build their own industries. It would also happen through a system of branch companies established in those nations based on capitalist interests. In other words, as more countries built factories and produced goods, they would stop buying from Germany. The markets that Germany depended on would shrink. Competition for the remaining markets would become increasingly violent. Eventually, the system would collapse into open conflict. In Hitler's view, Britain could support itself through free trade only because it had already conquered an empire by military force. Free trade, according to Hitler's logic, was a fraud. It only worked after you had already won through violence. Trade and industry could never save Germany. They would only lead to another war that Germany would lose. However, this theory was completely wrong on multiple levels. Economic history has shown that trade generally grows when more nations build industries, not shrinks. Building industries creates wealth that increases demand for goods from other countries. Nations specialize in what they produce most efficiently and trade with each other for mutual benefit. The global economy is not a fixed pie where one nation's gain must be another's loss. But Hitler couldn't see this because his entire worldview was based on winner-take-all thinking. He believed history was defined by struggle between peoples for limited food and resources. There was no possibility of cooperation or mutual advancement. Only conquest and control mattered. This mental framework made it impossible for him to understand how modern economics actually worked. Hitler's rejection of international trade also aligned with his racial theories. He blamed Jews for promoting what he called the lie of peaceful economic competition. In his mind, international finance was controlled by a Jewish conspiracy that wanted to weaken and ultimately destroy the German race. Free trade was just another tool of this conspiracy. But the German people initially rejected Hitler's vision completely. In May 1928, just months before Hitler finished writing his second book, Germany held general elections. Historical records show that Hitler's party gained a tiny 2.5% of the vote, winning only 12 seats out of 491 in the Reichstag. By contrast, Stresemann's party still held a respectable 45 seats and enjoyed generous backing from big business. The Social Democrats increased their representation from 131 to 153 seats. Together with Stresemann's party and other democratic groups, they had a working majority. Gustav Stresemann continued for his fifth year as foreign minister. The German people had faced a stark choice between two visions of the future. Stresemann offered integration with the world economy, partnership with America and Britain, and prosperity through trade. Hitler offered territorial conquest, economic self-sufficiency, and war. The people chose Stresemann by a huge margin. The Nazis were so short on money after this defeat that they had to cancel their annual party rally. Sales of Mein Kampf had dropped so badly that Hitler's publishers decided to hold back his second book for fear of hurting the market further. The extreme nationalist movement seemed to be in final decline. Stresemann's strategy of international cooperation appeared vindicated by both economic success and democratic mandate. Yet within just over a year, everything would change. Starting in 1928, even before the stock market crash, American lending to Germany began falling. The flow of loans that had sustained German prosperity started to slow. The Young Plan negotiations in 1929 disappointed German hopes for major reductions in reparation payments. Then came the catastrophic stock market crash in October 1929. The financial crisis that began in 1929 wasn't caused by shrinking markets or too much industry. It resulted from a chain of policy failures and financial panic. The American stock market crashed because of speculation and weak banking regulations. The crisis spread because countries made it worse through protectionist policies and monetary contraction. When the Depression hit, American lending dried up completely. President Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, which raised American tariffs and made it even harder for European nations to earn dollars by selling to America. The system of international cooperation that Stresemann had built was collapsing. In September 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard. Within weeks, 12 countries followed Britain in allowing their currencies to float freely. 11 more countries reduced the value of their currencies while keeping a gold peg. Those staying on gold, including Germany, had no option but to defend their balance of payments by adopting strict restrictions on currency exchange and trade. Trade statistics show the devastating impact. German export volumes fell by 30% between 1931 and 1932 alone. Germany's trade surplus of 2.8 billion Reichsmarks in 1931 was cut within a year to just a few hundred million. The unity and mutual dependence of the world economy was now deeply in question. The tragic irony was that these real economic events seemed to confirm Hitler's delusions. The Great Depression appeared to prove that the international trading system was collapsing exactly as he had predicted. This gave his false theories a dangerous credibility. Nevertheless, this wasn't proof that Hitler's shrinking markets theory was correct. The collapse resulted from policy choices, not from certain economic laws. Countries that abandoned gold and allowed their currencies to adjust recovered more quickly. Countries that maintained rigid gold values and tried to protect their currencies through austerity suffered longer. The lesson was that economic policy mattered. Good policies could promote recovery, while bad policies deepened crisis. Historical analysis by economists has shown clearly that Hitler's interpretation was wrong. The Depression didn't prove that trade was doomed. It proved that maintaining international cooperation required good policy and strong institutions. When those failed, the system broke down. But the system could be rebuilt with better rules and better coordination. But Hitler interpreted the Depression as proof of his worldview. He saw it as confirmation that international capitalism was failing and that only territorial conquest could secure Germany's economic future. The crisis appeared to show that nations depending on international trade were vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Self-sufficiency through conquest seemed like the obvious solution. Hitler wasn't interested in rebuilding the system. He wanted to destroy it and replace it with German territorial empire. His economic delusions gave him a framework for rejecting any solution except war. Peaceful trade was impossible because markets were shrinking. Cooperation with other powers was impossible because they were controlled by Jewish finance. Democracy was impossible because it would lead to socialism and race death. Only conquest remained. The economic collapse destroyed Stresemann's strategy and gave Hitler the opening he needed. Stresemann himself died in October 1929, just days before the stock market crash, never seeing how completely his life's work would unravel. Within 5 years of the 1928 election that had seemed to bury Hitler's movement forever, he would be in power. His delusional economic theories would become official government policy, and Germany would be locked onto a path toward war driven by false beliefs about how the world economy worked. The shrinking markets delusion wasn't just an abstract philosophical error. It was the ideological foundation for a system that made war seem necessary and certain. Combined with the collapsing Mefo bills fraud and the nationalized war economy, it created a situation where the regime couldn't turn back. The economic crisis was approaching its breaking point, and Hitler's false theories told him that conquest was the only solution. That said, these economic pressures weren't the only forces pushing Germany toward war in 1939. The military situation was also creating its own urgent deadlines. Section 4. Enemies getting stronger. Germany's military advantage had an expiration date, and everyone knew it. By early 1939, the rapid rearmament had created genuine military power capable of challenging any single European opponent. The Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine were rebuilt and ready, but that power was temporary. Britain and France were rearming rapidly, and their industrial capacity vastly exceeded German production. Every month of peace meant the gap would narrow. Intelligence reports were clear. By 1941 or 1942, the Allies would surpass German military capacity. The window for action was closing. The rearmament process had begun immediately after January 1933. The Versailles Treaty had limited the nation to just 100,000 men with no air force permitted and only a small navy. Tanks, military aircraft, submarines, and heavy artillery were all banned. For years after the previous war, these limits were technically maintained, though secret rearmament happened beneath the surface. Then came the decision to violate the treaty openly. On March 16, 1935, military conscription was formally restored and announced publicly. The army would expand to 36 divisions, roughly 500,000 troops, 5 times the allowed limit. The existence of the Luftwaffe was revealed publicly as well, directly defying the ban on any air force. The international response was surprisingly weak. Britain, France, and Italy issued diplomatic protests. The League of Nations condemned the action with formal resolutions, but no major power took concrete steps to actually stop the rearmament. No serious economic sanctions were imposed, no military action was threatened, and no blockade was established. The Western powers would formally complain, but wouldn't actually enforce their own restrictions. This was a crucial lesson. Words could be ignored. Diplomatic protests meant nothing without force backing them up. Emboldened by this response, Germany accelerated the military buildup even further. The military buildup created forces with genuine combat capability. The Wehrmacht could defeat Poland easily in isolated combat, and could probably defeat France in a one-on-one war. The Luftwaffe could seriously challenge the Royal Air Force for air superiority over the continent. The quality of German equipment was high for 1939 standards. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter was one of the world's best, comparable to Britain's Spitfire. The Junkers Ju 87 Stuka dive bomber had proven devastatingly effective during the Spanish Civil War, providing close air support to Franco's forces with remarkable precision. German pilots received extensive training that emphasized practical combat skills. The Navy's expansion was more constrained but still significant. In 1935, Britain unwisely agreed to the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, allowing Germany to build up to 35% of British naval tonnage. This gave official permission to exceed Versailles limits. New battleships like Scharnhorst and Genocidal were constructed, and the massive Bismarck and Tirpitz began production. Most threateningly for British security, U-boats began rolling out in increasing numbers, with 57 operational or under construction by September 1939. The nation had become a military power capable of challenging any single European nation except possibly the Soviet Union with its enormous industrial base. This was real strength, not propaganda. However, this military advantage was temporary, and everyone in German intelligence knew it. Britain and France had finally started serious rearmament after the Munich Agreement in September 1938. The wake-up call prompted both nations to dramatically accelerate their military preparations, and the shift was visible in concrete production numbers. British aircraft production was expanding at an alarming rate. In 1938, Britain produced approximately 2,800 aircraft. In 1939, production jumped to approximately 8,000 as factories converted to wartime schedules. By 1940, Britain would produce over 15,000 aircraft, 5 times the 1938 output. Intelligence reports showed Britain was producing approximately 660 aircraft per month by late 1939, double the rate from a year earlier. The expansion wasn't just quantity, but also quality. New factories were being built specifically for aircraft production, while existing automobile factories converted to produce components and engines. The Supermarine Spitfire was entering mass production and proving equal or superior to the Bf-109 in many categories. The Hawker Hurricane was being produced in large numbers as a capable fighter. Modern bombers like the Wellington could reach German cities, and fighter command was being organized into an integrated air defense system with radar stations and coordinated squadrons. French military modernization was also underway. France was expanding tank production with modern designs, including the Char B-1 heavy tank and Somme S-35 medium tank, both arguably superior to most German tanks in armor and firepower. The Maginot Line fortifications along the German border were nearly complete and extremely strong. The strategic implications were stark. Britain's industrial capacity vastly exceeded German production and could draw on resources from its global empire. Britain controlled the seas through the Royal Navy, meaning it could sustain a long war of industrial production that Germany could never win. Combined Anglo-French industrial production exceeded German capacity by a considerable margin in 1939, and that gap would only grow wider with each passing year. The conclusion was straightforward. Delay meant defeat. Reports from military intelligence were analyzing Allied rearmament continuously, and the conclusions were troubling. Current projections showed that by 1941 or 1942, Britain and France would have air forces larger and more modern than the Luftwaffe, with fully equipped armies and economies mobilized for war production. The current German military advantage would disappear. Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, understood the naval timeline particularly well. The German Navy was building toward the Z Plan, an ambitious program to create a balanced fleet with 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, 4 aircraft carriers, and hundreds of submarines. However, this program wouldn't be complete until 1944 or 1945 at the earliest. When Britain declared war on September 3, 1939, Raeder wrote in his diary that this was a war we had no reason to expect before 1944. The Navy wasn't ready. Fighting Britain now meant fighting without the balanced fleet that could contest British control of the seas. Even Germany's own Navy commander didn't believe the nation was prepared. Yet the war came anyway because other pressures demanded immediate action. Beyond the Western Allies, the Soviet Union represented the largest unknown factor and the most dangerous long-term threat. The USSR possessed the world's largest army with perhaps 5 million men under arms, larger than all other European armies combined. More significantly, Soviet industrial capacity was enormous, built up through brutal 5-year plans that had transformed an agricultural economy into an industrial powerhouse in just 1 decade. The production numbers were staggering. Soviet factories produced thousands of tanks annually, with output often exceeding 3,000 per year. Aircraft production reached approximately 8,000 in 1939, matching British output. Meanwhile, artillery production exceeded German capacity by a wide margin. Adding to this industrial might, coal production exceeded 100 million tons annually. Steel production approached 20 million tons, and oil production from Caucasus fields was substantial. Moreover, the USSR was geographically vast, stretching across 11 time zones with a population exceeding 170 million people and nearly inexhaustible resources. Critically, an enemy could occupy large portions of Soviet territory and still not defeat the nation because the industrial base could be evacuated eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. Nevertheless, there were serious questions about Soviet military effectiveness. Stalin's brutal purges in 1937 and 1938 had destroyed the Soviet officer corps, with thousands of experienced officers arrested or executed on false charges. Subsequently, the Red Army's performance in the 1939 to 1940 Winter War against Finland revealed serious organizational and tactical problems, and Soviet equipment quality was generally inferior to German standards. Despite these weaknesses, the sheer scale of Soviet forces couldn't be ignored. If the Soviet Union entered a European war on the Allied side with Britain and France, German forces would face enemies on two fronts simultaneously. The nightmare scenario of the previous war would be repeated. Worse, the diplomatic situation was making this likely. Britain and France were actively negotiating with the Soviet Union throughout spring and summer 1939, seeking to create an alliance that would encircle Germany from east and west. These weren't casual discussions, but serious negotiations involving specific military commitments and detailed alliance terms. British and French military delegations traveled to Moscow in August 1939 for extended talks with Soviet officials. The delegations included senior officers empowered to negotiate concrete terms, how many divisions each power would contribute, coordinated military planning for a two-front war, and allowing forces to transit through Poland to reach Soviet positions. If these negotiations succeeded, Germany would face an impossible strategic situation against Britain, France, and the Soviet Union at once. The combined population, industrial capacity, and military forces would overwhelm Germany completely. Strategic encirclement would be complete, with enemies attacking from opposite directions. The alliance negotiations weren't the only deadline. Weather imposed its own rigid constraints on military timing. Central European weather patterns made mechanized operations difficult or impossible during certain seasons. Summer provided the best conditions with dry roads, long daylight hours, and reliable equipment function. However, autumn rains would turn roads into mud, stopping tank advances completely. Winter brought freezing temperatures and snow that made mobile warfare nearly impossible. The optimal campaign season was roughly June through September, 4 months maximum for reliable mechanized operations. The invasion needed to happen before early September, or weather would force postponement until spring 1940. That delay would be disastrous. 6 more months of Allied rearmament, 6 more months of British aircraft production, adding nearly 4,000 fighters and bombers. 6 more months of economic strain as Mefo bills matured, and 6 more months of resource depletion. The military timetable was unforgiving. Act now in the narrow window available, or wait 6 months and face stronger enemies with a weaker economy. The invasion plan was ruthlessly simple. Case White called for attacks from 3 directions to encircle Polish forces quickly. The goal was a decisive victory within 2 to 3 weeks. Speed was critical to finish before Britain and France could intervene. German military planning assumed, correctly as events proved, that Britain and France couldn't effectively help Poland even if they wanted to. Poland was geographically separated from its Western allies by German-controlled territory with no common border. France could theoretically attack Germany's western border while German forces were engaged in Poland, but the Maginot Line fortifications made such an attack extremely difficult. Britain's small professional army couldn't reach Poland, and naval power couldn't affect land combat there. This geographic reality was central to German calculations. Poland would have to fight alone during the critical first weeks. By the time Britain and France could organize effective assistance, the campaign would already be over. When Britain and France declared war on September 3, 1939, they couldn't immediately help Poland militarily despite formal alliance obligations. The Polish campaign was effectively over in 5 weeks before Western aid could arrive. Beyond the economic and strategic calculations, there was a military culture pushing toward war. Officers who had planned operations for years wanted to prove their skills in actual combat. The Wehrmacht was ready in 1939, perhaps more ready than it would ever be again. Delaying while enemies grew stronger made decreasing sense. This created a dynamic where military logic pushed toward war even among officers who weren't ideologically committed to the regime. Many German officers were conservative Prussian aristocrats who privately disliked the regime's vulgarity, but they understood military mathematics clearly. If conflict with the Western powers was inevitable, then fighting while holding clear advantages made more sense than waiting until opponents were stronger. Some generals did oppose the rush to war. General Ludwig Beck resigned in August 1938 over disagreements about Czech policy and the risks of general European war. General Franz Halder, Beck's successor as Chief of the General Staff, discussed plans with other officers to remove the dictator if he ordered invasion of Czechoslovakia. However, when bloodless victory was achieved at Munich, military opposition collapsed. Aggressive diplomacy appeared to work brilliantly, while caution looked foolish. By August 1939, active military opposition had ceased to exist. Most generals had accepted that Poland would be invaded according to Case White's timeline. The military was operationally prepared with equipment positioned, troops trained, and plans rehearsed. The invasion could begin immediately on command. The military calculations explained why the war came when it did. Germany struck in 1939 instead of 1941 because the advantage was vanishing. Moreover, September was chosen over waiting another year because every month meant facing stronger enemies. Combined with economic collapse and idealistic demands, the military window made September 1939 the point of no return. Germany's advantage existed now, but would vanish within 2 years as Allied rearmament accelerated. The calculation was brutal. Strike now with an advantage, or wait and face impossible odds. But the economic crisis and military deadlines were only 2 of the pressures. The regime had made promises that could only be kept through conquest. Section 5. Promises that required war. Between 1933 and 1939, everything was organized around one central goal: Lebensraum, or living space. This wasn't campaign rhetoric or vague ambition. It was the core mission justifying the regime's existence. The promises had been made to everyone. Party members expected careers administering conquered territories. Soldiers expected glory in victorious campaigns. The German public expected dramatic reversal of the 1918 defeat. Industrial leaders expected resources from the East, and farmers expected land for settlement. Without expansion, the entire system would lose legitimacy. Why endure dictatorship, economic hardship, and militarization if the promised rewards never came? However, these weren't new ideas improvised in the 1930s. These beliefs had formed decades earlier during Hitler's Vienna period from 1909 to 1913. William Shirer's biographical research shows these were the crucial formative years when resentment and racial theories formed into a coherent worldview. Those years were spent in extreme poverty, living in homeless shelters. Vienna was a diverse city with a large Jewish population and ethnic groups from across the Austro-Hungarian Empire. During this period, Hitler absorbed the anti-Semitism of Vienna's mayor Karl Lueger and the pan-German nationalism of politician Georg von Schönerer through cheap pamphlets and popular magazines. Moreover, failed art school applications to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts in 1907 and 1908 created lasting resentment against the cultural establishment. Poverty and failure bred deep grievances. Living among diverse populations while believing in German superiority created mental conflict resolved through racial thinking. When Hitler left Vienna for Munich in 1913, the core worldview was already established. World War I service from 1914 to 1918 reinforced these beliefs. He served as a corporal in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment and received the Iron Cross First Class in 1918, rare for a corporal, which gave him military respect. In October 1918, a British gas attack temporarily blinded him and put him in Hosbach Military Hospital when Germany surrendered. The November 10, 1918 armistice announcement at Hosbach Hospital became Hitler's personal mythology. In his own later account, he claimed this moment triggered his decision to enter politics and restore German greatness. Whether true or embellished, the story became central to his self-image as a man with a historic mission born from national humiliation. Subsequently, these beliefs appeared fully formed in Mein Kampf, written during imprisonment after the failed beer hall putsch of November 1923. William Shirer's research documents that the book was published in 2 volumes, the first in July 1925 and the second in December 1926. Both volumes sat on German bookstore shelves for years where anyone could purchase and read Hitler's detailed plans. The world had approximately 13 years of explicit warning before these plans were implemented. Most people either didn't read it carefully, didn't take it seriously, or didn't believe such radical ideas would really be attempted. The core concept driving everything was Lebensraum itself. The argument rested on social Darwinist ideas claiming that nations were like biological organisms locked in perpetual struggle for survival and resources. Strong races naturally expanded while weak races were naturally conquered or eliminated. Germany, as a superior race, deserved more territory than it possessed within borders established by Versailles. The German people needed agricultural land to feed themselves, natural resources to sustain their industrial civilization, and an empire matching their supposed racial superiority. Donald Cameron Watt's analysis emphasizes that Lebensraum wasn't just fantasy, but also framed as practical necessity. This worldview provided moral justification for Eastern conquest, transforming resource needs into a sacred mission of racial destiny. Critically, Lebensraum wasn't a vague concept. Hitler was remarkably specific. Not colonies in Africa or Asia, which he dismissed as worthless, and not overseas territories vulnerable to British naval power. Instead, Lebensraum would come directly from Eastern Europe, the territories of Poland, Ukraine, and Western Russia. These regions possessed the agricultural resources that Germany supposedly needed. Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of Europe, with incredibly fertile black soil capable of feeding millions. Additionally, they were inhabited by Slavic peoples whom Nazi racial theories considered inferior and therefore legitimate targets for conquest. They could be conquered militarily, their populations enslaved or driven out, and the land colonized by German settlers. The first sentence of Mein Kampf revealed the obsession with German unification across borders, stating that German Austria must return to the great German motherland. This referred to Braunau am Inn, Hitler's birthplace on the German-Austrian border, and predicted the Anschluss that would occur 13 years later in March 1938. Throughout Mein Kampf, the theme returned repeatedly that all German-speaking peoples must be united in one state. Austria had to be absorbed. The Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, with its 3 million ethnic Germans, had to be annexed, and German minorities in Poland had to be brought into the Reich. However, the text went far beyond pan-German nationalism alone. It argued that uniting ethnic Germans was merely the first step toward the real goal, conquering living space in the East, regardless of whether those territories contained Germans or not. The book stated that Germany must stop its movement to the south and west and turn its gaze toward the land in the east. Germany must finally end the colonial and commercial policy and shift to a soil policy of the future. Eastward territorial expansion was the fundamental goal. Everything else was preparation. The justification combined several distinct currents into one toxic mixture. Social Darwinism provided the framework about nations locked in perpetual struggle for survival. Pan-German nationalism contributed to the goal of uniting all German speakers. Racial pseudoscience provided supposed justification for claims of German superiority and Slavic inferiority. Anti-Semitism identified Jews as the ultimate racial enemy working to undermine German strength from within, while anti-communism targeted the Soviet Union as both an opponent to destroy and a territorial prize to seize. These elements fused into a complete worldview that demanded aggressive expansion as both racial and national requirement. What distinguished Nazi thinking from traditional great power competition was its totality and racial character. Most nations throughout history have pursued territorial expansion for understandable reasons: economic resources, strategic advantage, national prestige, or security buffers. These motivations, while not always legitimate, are at least rational within traditional frameworks of international relations. By contrast, Nazi Germany pursued expansion for what it claimed were existential reasons based on racial pseudoscience. The argument was that Germans would literally die out as a race without acquiring living space, with biological extinction or conquest as the only alternatives. There was no middle ground, no compromise, no negotiation. This framing made peaceful coexistence impossible from the beginning. From 1933 to 1939, actual foreign policy actions consistently reflected the Mein Kampf blueprint. Every major decision moved toward the Lebensraum goal. The sequence was logical from the Nazi perspective. First, overturn Versailles restrictions and rearm Germany to create the necessary military power. Second, consolidate all German-speaking peoples through annexations of Austria and the Sudetenland. Third, eliminate Czechoslovakia as an independent buffer state blocking eastern expansion. Fourth, turn definitively eastward toward Poland and beyond. Each step was deliberate preparation for the next stage in the program laid out years earlier. The annexation of Austria on March 12, 1938, demonstrated this pattern clearly and established precedents for future action. Germans and Austrians shared language, culture, history, and ethnicity dating back centuries. The Versailles Treaty explicitly forbade their political unification to keep Germany weak. Hitler violated that prohibition directly and annexed Austria without encountering military resistance from any power. The sequence of events moved rapidly in early 1938. On February 12th, Hitler summoned Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg to Berchtesgaden and subjected him to hours of threats, demanding that Austrian Nazis be brought into the government and that Austrian foreign policy align with Germany's. Schuschnigg agreed under pressure, but then tried to resist by calling a referendum on Austrian independence for March 13th. In response, Hitler mobilized troops and issued an ultimatum on March 11th. Schuschnigg resigned, and German troops crossed the border on March 12, 1938, meeting no resistance. Hitler personally entered Austria that same day, returning to his birthplace of Braunau am Inn in triumph. On March 13th, Austria was officially incorporated into Germany. A rigged vote held on April 10th claimed 99.7% approval. The annexation was complete within 48 hours. This wasn't merely about adding 7 million people or gaining industrial resources. It was about establishing the precedent that ethnic unity justified territorial change, regardless of international treaties. Austria's territory surrounded Czechoslovakia from the south, making that nation vulnerable to pressure from two directions. In addition, Austrian industrial capacity was absorbed into German rearmament, and Austrian manpower could be conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Most importantly, it proved the pattern worked: make demands, apply pressure, threaten force, and achieve objectives without actually fighting. The Sudetenland crisis of 1938 followed the same pattern with even more dramatic results. Czechoslovakia contained approximately 3 million ethnic Germans living primarily in border regions called the Sudetenland. These Germans had never been part of Germany historically, but had been included in Czechoslovakia when it was created after World War I. Hitler demanded these territories be transferred to Germany to unite ethnic Germans and protect them from alleged Czech persecution. The crisis built through spring and summer 1938 with escalating demands, Nazi propaganda about mistreatment of Sudeten Germans, and clear military preparations for invasion. Despite Czechoslovakia's military alliances with France and the Soviet Union, its defensible borders with strong fortifications, and its modern army with excellent equipment, the outcome would shock the world. Yet Britain and France pressured Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland rather than fight to defend it. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times in September 1938 to negotiate with Hitler. The Munich Conference on September 29th to 30th, 1938, included Germany, Italy, Britain, and France, but excluded Czechoslovakia itself from deciding its own fate. The Munich Agreement of September 30th, 1938, gave Hitler everything he demanded without a single shot being fired. Czechoslovakia was ordered to surrender the Sudetenland within 10 days, dismantling Czech fortifications and leaving the strategic border indefensible. Chamberlain returned to London declaring "peace for our time" to cheering crowds relieved that war had been avoided. The Munich Agreement was an enormous victory beyond the territorial gain. It proved that aggressive demands backed by military threats could succeed against democratic opponents, that Britain and France would sacrifice other nations to avoid war, and that military alliances couldn't be trusted when tested. Most importantly for future policy, it established that Hitler could achieve territorial goals through intimidation rather than costly combat. Consequently, this success proved aggressive policies right and discredited caution among German leadership. The Munich pattern seemed endlessly repeatable. Make demands, threaten war, watch the democracies back down, and gain territory without fighting. Within Germany, Hitler's prestige reached new heights after gaining Austria and the Sudetenland within 6 months without combat. Unfortunately, the pattern contained a mistake that would become apparent within months. Indeed, the Munich success created its own trap. The pattern couldn't continue indefinitely without eventually triggering war. Each bloodless victory raised expectations for the next one, and each successful territorial gain created momentum demanding more. The regime's domestic legitimacy increasingly rested on continued foreign policy successes. Stopping would appear as weakness, and hesitation would seem like failure. Just 6 months later, in March 1939, Hitler violated the Munich Agreement by seizing the remainder of Czechoslovakia that wasn't ethnically German. German troops occupied Prague and dissolved Czechoslovakia as an independent state, with Bohemia and Moravia becoming German protectorates while Slovakia became a puppet state. This action fundamentally changed the international situation because it couldn't be justified by ethnic unity or self-determination. Czechs weren't Germans and didn't want incorporation into Germany. This was open conquest for strategic advantage, not ethnic consolidation. As a result, Britain and France finally recognized that appeasement had failed. Hitler's ambitions weren't limited to uniting ethnic Germans, but extended to systematic conquest regardless of ethnicity. Britain responded by guaranteeing Poland's independence on March 31, 1939, while France renewed its alliance with Poland. Both powers began serious rearmament. Further expansion would certainly trigger war with the Western powers. The bloodless victories were over, and the trap was complete. This created an ideological commitment that made retreat impossible. Throughout the regime's 6-year history from 1933 to 1939, everything had been built on the promise of Lebensraum. It had been written about extensively in Mein Kampf for anyone to read. It had been spoken about in countless speeches to party rallies and military audiences. The entire state apparatus had been organized around preparing for Eastern expansion. As 1939 arrived, turning back would mean admitting the whole project was pointless and fraudulent from the beginning. It would mean abandoning the one thing that supposedly justified Nazi rule and made the regime's existence meaningful. It would destroy the regime's legitimacy, not with the Western powers who already opposed it, but with its own supporters and the German population who had made sacrifices based on promises. Furthermore, some Nazi leaders were even more radical and aggressive than Hitler himself, constantly pushing for faster and more extreme action. Men like Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, and Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels competed intensely to prove their loyalty through advocacy of increasingly extreme positions. This created internal pressure within the regime's leadership. If Hitler hesitated or appeared weak, more radical voices would question his commitment to fundamental Nazi goals. The regime's internal dynamics systematically rewarded aggression and extremism while punishing any suggestion of caution and moderation. This made it progressively harder to pull back even if that had been desired. The radicals would view any hesitation as betrayal of the movement's core principles. The ordinary German public's understanding of and support for Lebensraum was more complicated and unclear than regime propaganda suggested. How much did average Germans understand about what Lebensraum actually meant in practice? How much did they actively support the program versus passively accepting it without thinking deeply? The historical evidence is mixed and incomplete. Most Germans certainly knew Hitler promised to make Germany strong again and wanted to overturn Versailles restrictions that seemed unjust. They probably supported unification with Austria and the Sudetenland, which could be framed as bringing Germans home to the Reich. Did ordinary Germans fully grasp that Lebensraum meant conquering Eastern Europe, enslaving or eliminating Slavic populations, and establishing a racial empire through systematic violence? Probably not in explicit detail. The regime's propaganda was deliberately vague about ultimate goals while being crystal clear about grievances against Versailles and supposed threats from enemies. When war finally arrived, public opinion wasn't enthusiastically pro-war despite years of militaristic propaganda. When Hitler announced the Polish invasion on September 1, 1939, there were no mass celebrations in German streets like there had been 25 years earlier in August 1914 at the start of World War I. People were visibly worried and anxious, not excited or eager. Memories of that earlier war were still painfully fresh in collective memory. The previous conflict had killed 2 million Germans and ended in disastrous defeat and humiliation. The prospect of another major war generated deep anxiety throughout German society, not enthusiasm or eagerness for combat. However, public opinion didn't meaningfully constrain policy decisions in 1939 because Nazi Germany was a totalitarian dictatorship. The regime didn't require popular enthusiasm for its policies, but rather obedience and acceptance from the population. As long as people followed orders and didn't actively resist, their private doubts were politically irrelevant. Most people did obey despite private reservations, and opposition that existed was fragmented, disorganized, and ultimately powerless to change policy. Beyond public opinion, Hitler's personal psychology also played a significant role in the push toward war. He saw himself as a historic figure destined to accomplish a great mission for the German race, and believed he was the only person who could restore German greatness. This wasn't a clinical delusion requiring treatment. Hitler really did hold enormous power and had achieved remarkable political success against long odds. Nevertheless, it was arrogance that made him willing to gamble everything on his vision of racial destiny, with personal conviction that he was right despite all opposition. Years earlier, Hitler had been explicit about these ideological goals. The most important evidence came from a November 5, 1937 meeting recorded in the Hosbach Memorandum, named after Colonel Friedrich Hosbach, who took detailed notes. This 4-hour conference included Hitler, Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath, War Minister Werner von Blomberg, and the commanders of the 3 armed services. During this meeting, Hitler stated that Germany's main problem was shortage of living space that constrained economic development and population growth. He said this problem could only be solved by force, not negotiation or peaceful means. Diplomatic solutions had failed, and only territorial conquest could provide genuine security and resources. He identified Austria and Czechoslovakia as first targets for expansion within the next few years. Hitler predicted conflict with Britain and France was probably inevitable at some point, though he hoped to achieve early objectives before triggering general war. He said Germany must be prepared to act decisively when circumstances were favorable, likely between 1943 and 1945 when German rearmament reached peak strength. But he also mentioned that earlier action might be necessary if opportunities arose, or if Germany's relative advantage began fading. Several attendees expressed concerns about the risks of war with Britain and France. Foreign Minister Neurath warned that German forces weren't ready for a general war, while War Minister Blomberg questioned whether France could be easily handled. Yet Hitler dismissed these objections. The mission was clear: War was the necessary means to achieve Lebensraum, and those who doubted would be eliminated from leadership. Within months, everyone who objected at the conference was removed. In January 1938, War Minister Blomberg was forced out over a personal scandal that may have been manufactured. The following month, Foreign Minister Neurath was replaced by the more compliant Joachim von Ribbentrop, and General Werner von Fritsch, army commander who also expressed doubts, was removed on false charges. The message was unmistakable: support the mission or be eliminated. More than a year later, in a speech to military commanders on May 23, 1939, Hitler stated even more explicitly that the coming conflict wasn't really about Danzig or the Polish corridor. Those were merely convenient excuses for public consumption. The real goal was living space in the East as outlined in Mein Kampf years earlier. He told his generals that war with the Western powers was probably unavoidable at some point. He predicted the conflict would be long and difficult because Britain's industrial capacity and empire resources were powerful. Germany might face years of grinding warfare. Yet, he insisted Germany must proceed anyway because the ideological commitment required it regardless of risks or costs. The racial mission of securing living space couldn't be abandoned or postponed indefinitely. Hitler emphasized that Germany must strike while conditions were favorable, even if not perfect. Waiting for ideal conditions meant never acting. The military window was closing, Allied rearmament was accelerating, and diplomatic isolation was increasing. This May 23, 1939 speech revealed the thinking clearly. The invasion of Poland was certain. War with Britain and France was probable, but the mission overrode all practical considerations. Lebensraum was the goal. Everything else was secondary. In September 1939, the convergence of ideological imperatives, economic desperation, and military calculations had eliminated every alternative except immediate war. The regime was bound by its own promises and could not turn back. Now there was one final step that made war certain. Section 6. The Genocidal Mission. The promises of Lebensraum sounded like traditional territorial expansion. Gain land, acquire resources, establish an empire. Many Germans probably understood it this way, as straightforward conquest similar to what European powers had done for centuries in building colonial empires. But there was something completely different about Nazi expansion that made it incompatible with peace. The regime wasn't planning to conquer and govern territories in the traditional sense. From the very beginning, the entire belief system was built on the premise that certain groups of people needed to be eliminated. The conquest of living space wasn't just about taking land. It required removing the people already living there. This wasn't something that developed gradually during wartime. It was present in Nazi ideology from the start, written explicitly in Hitler's own works, and implemented through policy years before any major war began. Understanding this genocidal foundation is essential to understanding why the regime couldn't turn back from war in 1939. The clearest early evidence comes from Mein Kampf itself, written in 1924 and published in 1925 and 1926. The book is famous for its discussion of Lebensraum, but what many people miss is how Hitler explicitly connected territorial expansion with racial elimination. He didn't just want land in the East, he wanted land cleared of its existing populations. Historical analysis of the text reveals Hitler's core belief about racial hierarchy. At the top were Aryans, supposedly the master race destined to rule. Below them were various grades of inferior peoples. Slavs were categorized as subhuman, suitable only for slave labor or removal. Jews were identified as the ultimate racial enemy, a parasitic presence that had to be completely eliminated for the Aryan race to survive. This wasn't abstract philosophy. Hitler was explicit about what Lebensraum would require in practice. The populations of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia would need to be either enslaved, driven out, or eliminated. The land would then be colonized by German settlers. This was ethnic cleansing and genocide written into the program from day one. Nonetheless, these ideas remained theoretical until the regime gained power in 1933. Once in control of the German state, the regime immediately began implementing policies that revealed its true nature. The persecution of Jews started within months of Hitler becoming chancellor. By April 1933, just 3 months after taking power, the regime organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. SA stormtroopers stood outside Jewish shops with signs telling Germans not to enter. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 made the persecution systematic and legal. These laws stripped Jews of German citizenship, prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jews, and began the formal process of excluding Jews from German society. This wasn't random discrimination. It was the systematic legal framework for eventually removing Jews from Germany entirely. The violence escalated throughout the 1930s. Kristallnacht on November 9th to 10th, 1938, represented a turning point. Across Germany and Austria, Nazi party members and SA troops destroyed Jewish synagogues, smashed windows of Jewish-owned stores, and attacked Jews in their homes and on the streets. Historical records document that 91 Jews were murdered during the pogrom itself, with many more dying later from injuries or in concentration camps. Over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The regime didn't hide this violence. It happened openly in full view of the German public. The message was clear. Jews had no place in German society, and violence against them was acceptable. More importantly, the German public largely accepted this message. There were no mass protests against Kristallnacht. Most Germans either participated, watched passively, or looked away. Yet the persecution wasn't limited to Jews. The regime also targeted other groups it deemed undesirable or dangerous to racial purity. The Romani people, whom the Nazis called gypsies, faced systematic persecution. They were classified as racially inferior and subjected to forced sterilization, imprisonment in camps, and murder. Homosexuals were arrested under paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code, which criminalized homosexual acts. Thousands were sent to concentration camps where many died. Political opponents disappeared into the concentration camp system that was established almost immediately after the regime took power. Dachau, the first major camp, opened in March 1933, just 2 months after Hitler became chancellor. By 1939, a network of camps existed across Germany, holding tens of thousands of prisoners. These weren't prisoners of war or criminals in the normal sense. They were people the regime wanted to eliminate from society. Most ominously, the regime began planning what would become known as the T4 Euthanasia program. Though the mass killings wouldn't begin until 1939, the planning and groundwork occurred earlier. The program targeted Germans with mental and physical disabilities. The Nazi philosophy viewed these people as life unworthy of life, useless eaters consuming resources without contributing to the racial community. The regime conducted surveys of mental institutions and hospitals throughout the mid-1930s, creating lists of potential victims. Doctors and psychiatrists were recruited to participate in selection committees. The bureaucratic and medical apparatus for mass murder was being assembled years before the killings began. In October 1939, just weeks after the invasion of Poland, Hitler signed the order authorizing the program. By the time it was officially stopped in August 1941, over 70,000 disabled Germans had been murdered. But the euthanasia program revealed something crucial about how the regime operated. The methods developed for killing disabled Germans would later be applied to Jews and other groups on a much larger scale. Gas chambers were first used in the T4 program. The bureaucratic procedures for selecting victims, transporting them to killing centers, and disposing of bodies were all pioneered in this program. The regime was learning how to commit mass murder efficiently. The personnel involved in the euthanasia program would later staff the death camps in occupied Poland. The techniques, the equipment, and the trained killers were all ready before the war began. The infrastructure of genocide existed in 1939. It was waiting for the opportunity to expand. On January 30th, 1939, Hitler gave a speech to the Reichstag that has become infamous in historical memory. He declared that if international Jewish financiers succeeded in plunging the nations into another world war, the result would not be the Bolshevization of the earth and the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. This wasn't a private conversation or a secret document. Hitler said this publicly in the German parliament with the speech broadcast on radio and reported in newspapers. He was openly threatening genocide against European Jews if war came. The world was being told exactly what would happen, and most people didn't take the threat seriously. The speech is important because it shows Hitler connecting war and genocide explicitly. In his mind, they were inseparable. War would provide the opportunity and cover for mass murder. The chaos of combat would hide atrocities. Conquered territories would provide places to commit genocide away from international observation. War wasn't just a means to gain territory. It was the necessary condition for implementing the full genocidal program. This connects directly back to Lebensraum and explains why the regime couldn't avoid war. The living space in the East couldn't be acquired peacefully. It wasn't empty land waiting to be settled. It was inhabited by millions of Slavic peoples whom Nazi belief system marked for elimination or enslavement. Acquiring that space meant removing those populations through systematic violence. Moreover, the regime's entire racial program required war. The persecution of Jews within Germany had reached its practical limits by 1938. Jews could be stripped of citizenship, excluded from professions, and driven into poverty. But Germany still contained hundreds of thousands of Jews. Other countries wouldn't accept large numbers of Jewish refugees. The regime needed somewhere to send them, and ultimately, Nazi ideology didn't want to expel Jews but to eliminate them entirely. War would solve these problems from the Nazi perspective. Conquered territories would provide space for concentration camps and killing operations far from Germany proper. The chaos and violence of war would make mass murder easier to hide. Military operations would provide cover for genocide. The entire system was designed to function through aggressive war, not despite it. The regime had also created a culture of violence and dehumanization that required external outlets. For 6 years, Nazi propaganda had taught Germans that Jews, Slavs, and other groups were subhuman threats to German survival. Stormtroopers and SS men had been organized and trained for violence. The party apparatus was filled with true believers expecting radical action. All this violent energy and devotion needed an outlet. Peace would leave these forces with no purpose. By September 1939, the genocidal machinery was ready and waiting. The concentration camp system existed. The bureaucratic procedures for mass persecution were established. The legal framework for stripping rights and seizing property was functioning. The personnel who would later operate death camps were trained. The ideological justification was in place. The only thing missing was the opportunity that war would provide. This made war inevitable because the regime couldn't turn back without abandoning its core identity. The persecution of Jews and other groups wasn't a side project or secondary goal. It was central to Nazi worldview. Lebensraum wasn't just about land. It was about racial empire requiring elimination of inferior peoples. The entire system was built around these genocidal aims. If Hitler had backed down in 1939, what would happen to all these promises and preparations? The true believers who joined the party expecting radical racial revolution would be betrayed. The SS and SA men trained for violence would have no mission. The bureaucrats organizing persecution would have no purpose. The entire ideological framework would collapse. More importantly, Hitler himself believed in these principles completely. This wasn't cynical manipulation for power. He genuinely believed in racial struggle, Aryan superiority, and the necessity of eliminating Jews. His worldview made peaceful coexistence impossible. There was no version of Nazi Germany that could exist indefinitely without war, because the core principle demanded expansion and genocide. The tragic irony is that the genocidal nature of the regime should have made opposition to it absolute and immediate. Instead, most of the world didn't take Nazi racial belief seriously until it was far too late. Hitler had written it all down in Mein Kampf. He had said it repeatedly in speeches. The persecution of Jews in Germany was visible to anyone watching. The warning signs were everywhere. But most people couldn't believe a modern European nation would actually attempt genocide in the 20th century. It seemed too extreme, too irrational, too evil to be real. People assumed Hitler's rhetoric was exaggeration for political effect. They thought Nazi racial policy would moderate once the regime was established. They were catastrophically wrong. The genocidal mission thus made war inevitable because it was inseparable from the regime's core identity and goals. Lebensraum required removing populations. The racial program required war to implement fully. The violent doctrine required external enemies and expansion to maintain internal unity. Peace meant abandoning everything the regime stood for. By September 1939, 7 years of persecution, propaganda, and preparation had created a system that could only function through aggressive war and mass murder. There truly was no way back. Section 7. No way back. On August 23, 1939, everything changed in a single day. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop stepped off an aircraft at Moscow's airport after a long flight from Berlin, carrying explicit instructions to finalize a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The prospect was shocking to informed observers worldwide who understood the political gap between the two powers. The two great enemies of the age, fascism and communism, were about to make a deal that defied all expectations. Hitler had built his entire career on militant anti-communism, calling Bolshevism a Jewish conspiracy to destroy Western civilization. Stalin had positioned the Soviet Union as the global defender against fascism. For years, Nazi and communist parties had fought street battles in German cities, while their propaganda machines denounced each other as existential threats. The mutual hatred seemed absolute. Yet here was Ribbentrop, arriving in the Soviet capital to arrange an unlikely partnership that would shock the world and rewrite the strategic map of Europe. Stalin had been conducting parallel negotiations with Britain and France throughout the summer, trying to create an anti-German alliance. However, those negotiations had proceeded slowly and reached no conclusion. British and French delegations had arrived in Moscow by slow ships rather than aircraft, suggesting lack of urgency, and offered vague promises but no concrete military commitments or territorial guarantees that interested Stalin. Donald Cameron Watt's diplomatic research shows that Stalin realized that Germany's proposal served Soviet interests better than what Britain and France offered. Germany was willing to give Stalin a free hand in Eastern Europe, guaranteeing Soviet control over the Baltic states, Eastern Poland, and Bessarabia from Romania. In contrast, Britain and France offered only a defensive alliance that might draw the Soviet Union into war without territorial compensation. From Stalin's perspective, the German offer was vastly superior. Let Germany and the Western powers fight each other while the Soviet Union gained territory and stayed neutral. The meeting took place in the Kremlin with unusual speed. Joseph Stalin personally attended the negotiations, an unusual honor that demonstrated the immense importance he placed on this agreement. The negotiations lasted only a few hours because the main terms had been worked out in advance. Ribbentrop had authority to agree to virtually any Soviet demand, as Hitler wanted this pact desperately and was willing to pay Stalin's price. Shortly after midnight on August 24, 1939, the Nazi-Soviet pact was signed in Moscow with Stalin and Ribbentrop both present. Stalin toasted German-Soviet friendship with champagne, while Ribbentrop toasted Stalin's health. The atmosphere was friendly despite decades of mutual hatred. Ribbentrop immediately returned to Berlin in triumph, while Stalin celebrated securing the Soviet western border. Hitler was jubilant when he received news via coded telegram. The strategic situation had fundamentally shifted in Germany's favor overnight. The public agreement stated that Germany and the Soviet Union wouldn't attack each other for 10 years and would remain neutral if either became involved in war with third parties. They would cooperate economically, with Germany receiving Soviet raw materials, particularly oil and grain, in exchange for German industrial goods and advanced technology. But the public agreement was only half the story. Secret protocols that wouldn't be publicly revealed for many years divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence with cold precision. Donald Cameron Watt's research documents that these secret protocols carved up the region with ruthlessness and complete disregard for the nations involved. Germany would take western Poland up to approximately the Narew, Vistula, and San rivers, roughly half the country. The Soviet Union would take eastern Poland, claiming to protect Ukrainian and Belarusian populations. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania went entirely into the Soviet sphere for future absorption. Bessarabia, which belonged to Romania, also went to the Soviets for eventual seizure. Critically, the two totalitarian powers were dividing up Eastern Europe without consulting any of the countries involved. Poland didn't know its fate had been sealed and its territory divided. The Baltic states didn't know they would be absorbed into the Soviet Union within a year. Romania didn't know Bessarabia would be seized. Poland's fate was sealed the moment these secret protocols were signed on August 23rd. Germany would invade from the west with overwhelming force, while the Soviet Union would invade from the east after German forces had engaged Polish armies. Polish forces, however brave, couldn't possibly defeat both powers attacking simultaneously from opposite directions. The outcome was certain. Consequently, Hitler received news of the pact with unconcealed joy. The two-front war threat had been eliminated. Germany could attack Poland without worrying about Soviet intervention from the east. The strategic calculation favored immediate action. The window of opportunity was wide open. The major obstacles were removed, and the moment had arrived. On August 25, 1939, Hitler issued the invasion order with complete confidence. German forces would cross the Polish border at 4:30 a.m. on August 26th. The massive military machine began moving into position with over 1.5 million men preparing to advance from three directions. Poland's destruction seemed merely hours away. However, at 7:30 p.m. on August 25th, just 9 hours before the scheduled invasion, Hitler abruptly canceled the order. Chaos ensued as commanders frantically tried to recall forces already in motion. Some units had already crossed the border in reconnaissance missions and had to be pulled back urgently. Two pieces of critical news had arrived that afternoon, fundamentally changing Hitler's calculations. Britain had signed a formal mutual assistance treaty with Poland on August 25th, converting the March Guarantee into a binding legal commitment. Moreover, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini had informed Hitler that Italy wasn't ready for war and wouldn't honor its obligations under the Pact of Steel alliance. The British treaty was strategically significant. It meant Britain was serious about defending Poland this time, with the guarantee now a legally binding commitment, rather than just a political statement. It suggested Chamberlain had learned from Munich and wouldn't back down again. If Germany attacked Poland, Britain would actually fight with military force. William Shirer's detailed account records that Mussolini's message was equally damaging to Hitler's plans. Hitler had counted on at least Italian diplomatic support and possibly military action against France. Instead, Mussolini said Italy needed more time to prepare, lacking sufficient weapons, fuel, and raw materials for sustained combat. Mussolini offered to enter the war later if Germany could supply Italy's shortages with immediate material support. But Hitler couldn't do that since Germany barely had enough for itself. As a result, Italy was effectively backing out at the crucial moment. Italy would remain neutral until June 1940. Germany would fight alone. While the entire military apparatus waited for final orders, Hitler hesitated for 6 tense days. This was uncharacteristic behavior that worried his advisors and surprised military commanders. Hitler usually made quick decisions and stuck to them stubbornly. But the changed circumstances required careful reassessment of risks. Could Germany attack Poland and fight Britain and France simultaneously without Italian support? Would Britain really fight this time? Or was the treaty just another diplomatic bluff? The generals waited anxiously for final orders while units remained mobilized at enormous daily cost. Every day of mobilization cost millions of marks as soldiers consumed food and fuel. Vehicles required maintenance, and resources depleted. William Shirer's eyewitness account describes that Hitler's emotional state during these 6 days fluctuated between rage at Mussolini's betrayal and gloomy contemplation of risk. He would express confidence that Britain was bluffing, then worry about general European war. Those around him reported he looked older and more strained than before. This wasn't the confident leader who had achieved bloodless victories in Austria and Czechoslovakia. During these 6 days, from August 25th to August 31st, Hitler authorized diplomatic negotiations with Poland over Danzig and the Polish corridor for appearance purposes. Germany made demands that appeared reasonable. Return of Danzig to Germany, extraterritorial connections across the corridor allowing German transit to East Prussia, protection for German minorities, and plebiscites in disputed areas. In reality, These negotiations were pure theater designed for propaganda purposes. Watt's analysis makes clear that Hitler had already decided on war. The goal was creating the appearance of Polish stubbornness so Germany could claim self-defense when invasion came. Poland was given impossible deadlines measured in hours, not days. When Poland naturally rejected ultimatums delivered with insufficient time to respond, German propaganda would claim Poland refused peaceful solutions and chose war. Meanwhile, the pressure from other factors continued relentlessly. The military timetable was slipping with every day of delay. Invasion after mid-September would face autumn rains, turning roads to mud and stopping mechanized operations. If Hitler was going to back down, he needed to withdraw troops immediately and find a face-saving diplomatic exit. But withdrawal without victory would be a catastrophic political disaster, destroying regime credibility. Mobilization itself had created its own powerful momentum toward war. Over 1.5 million men had been mobilized at enormous economic cost. Workers pulled from factories and farmers taken from fields. Factories had shifted to accelerated war production with round-the-clock operations. The economy was operating in full war mode despite technically being at peace. In addition to this, calling off the invasion at this point would appear catastrophically weak to both domestic and international audiences. It would waste all the preparation and expense. Military officers had committed their reputations to the invasion plan, while party leaders had promised supporters that Poland would be crushed quickly and territories distributed. Hitler's personal authority and the regime's credibility rested on bold action producing success, not hesitation. If Germany backed down from Poland after full mobilization, would anyone fear German threats again? The whole pattern of successful intimidation depended on credible willingness to use force. The economic, military, and doctrinal constraints converged into an inescapable trap. Delay or retreat would trigger the very collapse that war was meant to prevent. On August 31, 1939, Hitler issued the final order. German forces would attack Poland at 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939. There would be no further delays or negotiations. The decision was absolute. To provide a pretext, the SS staged a crude false flag attack at Gliwice radio station near the Polish border. SS men dressed in Polish army uniforms attacked the German station and left behind bodies of concentration camp prisoners murdered specifically for this purpose. This transparent fabrication gave Hitler his excuse. Germany was merely responding to Polish aggression. No informed observer believed this obvious lie, but it provided the propaganda narrative. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the Wehrmacht crossed the Polish border from 3 directions at once. Over 1.5 million German troops advanced with overwhelming force. The Luftwaffe struck Polish airfields without warning in the pre-dawn darkness, destroying much of the Polish Air Force on the ground before pilots could take off. This air superiority allowed German bombers to attack communications, railroads, and mobilization centers without opposition. The war had begun. Tank divisions raced deep into Polish territory using Blitzkrieg tactics, bypassing strong points and cutting communications. The pattern was clear within hours. German forces were advancing faster than Polish units could react. Communications were disrupted, and command and control broke down as headquarters lost contact with forward units. Polish forces fought bravely in many locations despite hopeless situations. Polish cavalry fought as mobile infantry, and Polish infantry held positions to the last man in numerous battles. Nevertheless, individual courage couldn't overcome overwhelming material and tactical advantages. Britain and France issued ultimatums to Germany demanding immediate withdrawal from Poland. Hitler ignored them, correctly calculating they couldn't intervene quickly enough. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war at 11 a.m. following expiration of its ultimatum. France followed hours later. World War II had officially begun as a general European conflict. Still, declarations of war changed nothing on the ground in Poland. British and French forces didn't immediately attack Germany's western border despite having numerical advantage. The French army sat behind the Maginot Line fortifications. France launched a small offensive on September 7th with limited forces, advancing only a few miles before withdrawing. The Western Allies effectively did nothing to save Poland while it was crushed. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east as secretly agreed in the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Soviet forces crossed the border with over 800,000 troops, claiming they were protecting Ukrainian and Belarusian populations. Polish forces, already engaged heavily against Germany in the west, now faced attacks from two directions simultaneously with no possibility of success. The Polish government fled toward Romania seeking refuge. Warsaw was surrounded by German forces and bombed extensively. On September 27, 1939, after more than 2 weeks of constant bombardment, Warsaw surrendered. The Polish garrison had fought heroically but couldn't hold without relief. Germany and the Soviet Union held a joint victory parade in Brest-Litovsk on September 22, 1939, with German and Soviet officers saluting each other. The symbolism was clear. Fascism and communism had successfully cooperated to divide Eastern Europe. The Western democracies had declared war but done nothing to stop it. By early October 1939, all organized Polish resistance had been crushed. Poland ceased to exist as an independent nation, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union as the secret protocols specified. The campaign had lasted barely 5 weeks, demonstrating the effectiveness of modern mechanized warfare. Hitler's gamble had paid off completely. The convergence of economic desperation, military calculations, ideological imperatives, and the Nazi-Soviet Pact had made war inevitable. On September 1, 1939, all factors pointed in exactly the same direction. The system Hitler built over 6 years had its own logic and momentum that couldn't be stopped. The question was never whether war would come, but when. September 1, 1939, was the day when every alternative had been eliminated. Hitler wasn't simply choosing war out of evil intent alone. He felt trapped by the system he had built over 6 years. Every decision made between 1933 and 1939 had narrowed the options further. Every policy had created pressures demanding more aggressive action, and every success had raised expectations requiring greater victories. The invasion of Poland was the inevitable conclusion of a system designed for conquest that could only function through continuous expansion. From Hitler's perspective, war felt unavoidable. Every path except immediate military action had been eliminated. The real tragedy wasn't that war came on September 1, 1939. The tragedy was that so many opportunities to prevent it were missed in the years before. With that said, this only explains why Hitler started the war. To know the several reasons why he lost it, check this video next.